Hello and welcome to another My NT Married video. I wanted to talk about genetics today because this really intrigues me. Not in the try to get rid of it type of way, but just how it's passed on. When we saw the specialist who diagnosed our son, she said to us, well, she asked us a couple of questions and then said chances are that my husband has it, and she said to us from there that in her experience of diagnosing, she had found that it was always the case of if one child was on the spectrum, one parent or both were on the spectrum. And considering that she does this for a living, I imagine she knows what she's talking about. She had the theory that if neither parent is on the spectrum, it's because they haven't been diagnosed. So from her perspective, it's 100% genetic, and that one parent has to have it in order for a child to have it. I have met a lady who is on the spectrum who is married to a man on the spectrum, and they have 3 children. And she said that only 2 of her children are ASD. However, I have a feeling that maybe the one child that isn't, perhaps is so mild it's hard to tell, which is very sort of similar to how my husband is. You would never really get a sense that he's, well, I wouldn't say never. There may be people who could pick it. I have never had somebody come up to me and say, hey, is your husband on the spectrum? I think it's because it's well hidden in his case. That's maybe not the right terms. It doesn't show, it's not obvious. And so maybe even when people have ASD level 1, which used to be called Asperger's, but they're since deciding that they're no longer going to call it that, there's probably spectrums within the spectrum. So I have a feeling that some people who are on the spectrum, even high functioning, are hard to tell in amongst the high functioning. And again, I'm not even supposed to say high functioning because apparently that's offensive to the low functioning autistic people. And in saying that, I'm going to be impolitically correct here and say, I don't know if the low functioning autistic people would even pay attention to that, even notice that. So is it really offensive to them, or just the people who are carers of low functioning autistics? Anyway, I'm sure that's open for debate. But back to the topic at hand. So I have one child who is definitely 100% not autistic, another who has been diagnosed with autism, ASD level 1, low support needs. Oh, I'd say moderate support needs. His dad's low support needs. My son is more moderate support needs. And then I have another child who is not on the spectrum and yet has an incredible amount of mind blindness. He is really forgetful and messy. So everywhere he goes, he will leave parts of himself behind. So let's say, for example, he goes into the kitchen to make himself some noodles or toast or something. Without fail, he will leave noodle crumbs everywhere, the empty packet on the bench, things like that. And then he'll just go off and eat and then just completely forget that he needs to put away after himself. So I'm kind of constantly sort of saying, you know, hey, you've got this thing you haven't done. And he lives his life like that. Like, I took a series of photos, which I thought was funny at the time. There's like a soy sauce bottle sitting on a table, there's some jumper sitting over yonder, there's some other part of something that belongs to him over there. He's constantly getting things out and not putting them away. And he doesn't even think about it. It's not even like he'd go into the kitchen and see all those noodles or that empty packet of something or whatever and think, oh, I left that there, I should put it away. You'd actually have to remind him, even though it's plainly obvious it's right there. So he has an incredible amount of mind blindness. He is more messy than my autistic son. And so I'm wondering, are there levels? And I know this would be an incredibly unpopular opinion, but is it a case that if you have one autistic parent, or both, that each of the children have it to a certain degree, even if you can't actually tell? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a professional. I'm just wondering. I'm just putting it out there because my son has, the younger one who's mind blindness, he has certain traits, and yet he's not on the spectrum. He doesn't have the same sort of low emotional intelligence, as they say. He was always very awkward with socialising and things, even more awkward than his autistic brother, who just kind of goes into the room because he's got no fear, you know. He just goes into a room and he's like, here I am, hello people, and he'll just chat. Whereas the youngest one is far more sort of awkward and struggled to make friends. Then there is the case of my brother. I'm pretty sure that he's on the spectrum. Years and years and years ago, one of his friends said to us that he's more likely on the spectrum. And that friend said that because they had an ASD level 1 son who obviously is on the spectrum, and they were sort of looking at my brother and thinking, yeah, he's the same. And it wouldn't surprise me. My brother has always been a very unusual and unique individual. I may or may not make a video on his traits at a later date. So if my brother is on the spectrum, that would mean that one of my parents are. And I feel like it's not Dad, even though Dad is a stonewaller. Fascinating. He's the kind of person that if you upset him or offend him, he will go quiet. And that's usually where he gathers his thoughts and tries to sort of figure out, should he be offended? What bothered him? How's he going to move on from this? Should he have a conversation with you? Things like that. However, he's not autistic. He's far too sort of in touch with his emotions and things like this. Mum, on the other hand, I could see how she might be on the spectrum. Her favourite thing to do is puzzles. And she does puzzles all day, every day. She also has special interests that she will dive right into for a short amount of time, spend copious amounts of money on this new special interest, do it for a while, could be a year, or 2, 6 months, drop it and get a new one. And Mum has always been, how do you say this politely, tactless, blunt. She's very abrupt with the things that she says. She is definitely a name caller. Growing up, it was the thing she did the most, as in, when I say the most, like, if there were things that my parents were doing that were irksome, her name calling was up there at the top. A definite name caller. And she never understood, even to this day, how her way of being has affected us or why it bothers us. She cannot comprehend. She doesn't understand. She even said to me once, I don't understand why you like your dad more than me. And it was really hard to explain to her, although I did try, that Dad has never put me down or called me a name in my entire life. Never. Whereas my mum, I'll be talking to her on the phone and she'll just throw some random comment out there and you're like, oh, okay, all right. So, yeah, she's, I don't know, I mean, that obviously doesn't make her autistic because she's a name caller, but they too tend to have like a lacking of tact and be quite blunt and just say what's on their mind and be completely ignorant as to the effects that they have on those around them. That's definitely mum. And to the point where if we have visitors, she will stay in her space doing her crosswords. That's what she does. And really interestingly, I had a cousin who's maybe 10 years older than me. She was talking about how she used to come and visit when she was younger, and my mum would be sitting there doing crossword puzzles while we had visitors, and I'm thinking, that sounds like an autistic trait. She's not even putting it down to speak. And I have witnessed that myself. I just didn't know she'd done it with others. So that's a little bit fascinating. So point being, if my brother's on the spectrum, chances are he's got that from mum. Which then sort of makes me wonder with regards to the rest of the siblings, do we also have traits? Now I know it's very largely disliked when the neurotypicals come along and go, everybody's a little bit autistic. The autistic people would be thinking, hey, you don't like us for being autistic because we've got all these annoying traits that bother you, but suddenly you want to, just glide in on the bandwagon and say you have a few traits. I can see how that would be irksome for them. But hear me out. I have two other siblings who are now sort of debating, are they on the spectrum? They've started to notice things about themselves that have made them wonder. And I'm wondering, because they don't have a diagnosis yet, they may well be, but I'm wondering, could it be a case where if you are raised by a parent who's on the spectrum, you picked up their ways of being and turned them into traits? Is that a possibility? So, for example, I don't consider that I am autistic. Wouldn't it be amazing if I found out I was? Amazing's maybe not the word. I don't consider that I'm autistic. But I didn't like to be hugged or stopped as a child. If somebody came up and hugged me, I was like, oh, that's 1 second too long. Let's move it along here, folks. I've got things to do, places to be. I hated stopping to give people hugs. Now, obviously disliking hugs is not specifically an autistic trait, I guess. I don't know. But it makes me wonder, if my mum is on the spectrum, did my siblings and I just pick up traits and act like her because she was teaching us this is how you be? And then my brother, who's on the spectrum, is actually just on the spectrum. I mean, as I said, it could be that my siblings also are on the spectrum. And with my husband and him being on the spectrum, chances are one of his parents is on the spectrum. Now, his dad is a critiquer, like my husband, and his dad said that his dad was really hard to please, impossible to please were his words. And so is that just a random sort of family personality trait thing that's been handed down the line and not an autistic trait? Could it be the mum that's autistic? The mum definitely is blunt and says the randomest things. Like when we announced our second pregnancy, she said, oh, I thought you'd gotten fat. I'm like, okay. So I mean, like that, right? That could be an autistic trait. It could just be tactlessness. It's not to say that NTs can't be tactless as well, right? Anyway, are then some of his brothers and nephews and nieces also on the spectrum? Some of them do have meltdowns and things, just as our son did, so, that's a possibility. Or could it just be that one of the parents is on the spectrum and therefore some of the other siblings have also picked up those traits? So that's really what I'm wondering here. How much of an effect does the autistic parent have on the siblings or the children who aren't actually on the spectrum? And therefore those children could have some autistic traits, and therefore it might appear that everybody's a little bit autistic. Just maybe, I'm putting it out there. So on my side of the family, I have a cousin who is autistic, and I would say ASD level 2, high support needs. He does have a little flat and a girlfriend, reminds me of that Benny and June situation. However, he does need a lot of support, and he used to have incredible meltdowns when he was younger, to the point of violence and such, and detrimental to his parents and things. And I remember hearing way back then that it was supposedly because he'd had an injection, and that he'd gone in one way and came out another. And when I had my first child and he had his injections, I remember thinking it would be an impossibility to be able to tell whether somebody turned at 3 months because of an injection. So long before that myth was debunked, I thought that that was an impossibility. It made no sense to me. How could you have even been able to tell that, you know, he was one way one day, gets an injection, and then he's different? Anyway, myth debunked. Turns out that he would be autistic because one of his parents is autistic. Considering that my mum is potentially autistic because my brother is autistic, my brother has not been diagnosed, by the way, just put that out there. Then could it be that her sister, my auntie, who is the one who has the autistic son, is also on the spectrum? And does it run in my mum's family? Now here's an interesting thing. My cousin, her son, I believe, is on the spectrum. And I'd always thought it was because his dad was, because his dad doesn't talk. We would go for a visit. So it'd be my cousin, her partner, myself and my partner, and we'd be chatting away, and her partner would be practically silent. Even when you addressed him, he had nothing to say. He did not communicate or talk with you or anything. It was very, very unusual. And so I'd always thought the son had it from him. But now I'm sort of thinking about it and thinking, like, she does those social gaffes that people talk about. Those awkward things that just randomly get said and done in the middle of nowhere that make everybody sort of stop and look at her for a bit. I know that her family have treated her like they think she's odd and weird. I never really thought about it. I just took her for who she was. So let me just give you an example. She and I went out to eat one time, and the food came out, and she took one bite of it and kind of plonks her fork down really loudly on the plate and starts proclaiming that the meal is terrible and having this real sort of negative thing going on. And I'm sitting there trying to enjoy the night out and try to enjoy my meal while she's sitting opposite me, ropeable and annoyed that her meal is really terrible, and she kind of gets in this random funk, but also the biffing of the utensils onto the plate, bit of a clang, you know, it's kind of a like people could hear and look at you thing. And I would just be sitting there uncomfortable, thinking, oh, this meal isn't really going according to plan, because now I'm sitting across from somebody who's upset and not having a good time. So that's just a small sort of example of something that she does that means that she could potentially be on the spectrum. It doesn't prove it or necessarily mean that. I'm just putting it out there. And again, the point I'm getting at is I have a feeling that people on my mum's side, like there's probably more of us on the spectrum on my mum's side than we realised. Which again goes back to the concept of my mum potentially being on the spectrum. And so what I'm also wondering is, if my mum has it, do I have a dormant gene or a marker, M125 or something, right? I've completely made that number up. And then I pass that on to my children who have, let's just say, M125, and it's sitting somewhere in the little gene pool of their body. Could my, let's say, youngest son, who isn't on the spectrum but does have mind blindness, could he partner with somebody who's not on the spectrum and still have a child who is on the spectrum? Is that how it works? Somebody has said that it can skip generations, but admittedly the person who told me that is not a professional and has not studied autism. They've just said that it's a throwback thing. And I don't know, this is what I'm wondering. Is it? Is it something that sits in you that's dormant, and 2 generations, 1 generation later, they could be autistic without parents who are? According to my son's psychologist who diagnosed him, that isn't the case. One parent has to have it. But it makes me wonder too, again, with regards to what I was saying before about spectrums within spectrums, am I autistic to some degree because one of my parents is? My words are all over the shop today. My vocab is just... But is that a possibility? Like, I'm slightly autistic because somewhere in me is a part of the autistic genetics? I don't know. I mean, this is what's so fascinating about it to me. And this is what I mean when I talk about this video. I'm fascinated by that type of thing. But I've always been fascinated by genetics. When I was pregnant with my first son, I was reading a book on genetics, and it was saying that if you have a parent with dark hair and a parent with light hair, the dark hair will overrule the light hair in most cases. Somebody with a big nose and a small nose, the big nose will overrule the small nose in most cases. Dark eyes will overrule light eyes, full lips will overrule thin lips, things like that. I always found things like that fascinating. And it just makes me wonder, you know, is there a genetic marker? I assume there is. I haven't heard about it be spoken about before. You know how there's that breast cancer gene, and it's got a name, B something, I don't know, anyway. Is there something like that within the autistic genetics? And does it lie dormant, does it not? Does it have to have, I don't know, something that triggers it, or, I don't know, I know what I'm thinking in my mind, but it's really hard to verbalize it. It just makes me wonder, you know, do all of my children have autism to a certain degree, but it's only obvious in some because the dad has it and he's handed that on? I don't know, it's very, I don't know, thought-provoking. And what I also wonder too is, let's say my husband and I had children, he's autistic, and none of my children were autistic. Could they go on to have autistic children themselves because they have that genetic marker? I don't know, what do you think? Have you thought much about the genetics? With that woman who's on the spectrum and her husband's on the spectrum and they've got 3 children and she says one isn't on the spectrum, is that even a possibility? I mean, that intrigues me, because what I have heard is that if one parent has it and one parent doesn't, it's a 50-50 chance of any given child having it. They may not, they may. If both parents are on the spectrum, it's 100% likely that all of your children would have autism. And yet here's this woman saying her daughter doesn't. So is it just that her daughter has it so mildly you can't tell? Or would she really have a daughter who isn't on the spectrum? I would love to hear from you and all of the various situations that there are out there, because it's just curious to me. Are the both of you autistic and yet you have children who aren't? Let me know. Love to hear about that. If you have an autistic partner and several children but only one's being diagnosed? Are you in the same boat as me where you're sort of looking at some of your children and thinking they have certain traits? Or do you think that traits are just learned things? Like my mum is a very cold, distant, quiet, withdrawn woman, and she has quiet and withdrawn children who are introverts because she's introverted. Did we just learn growing up as her being our primary carer to just follow along and pick up the traits that she has? Or is there a potential that, say, I'm 5% autistic when my brother is 90% autistic, and then my other siblings maybe 75? I mean, I'm really just throwing that out there. It doesn't kind of sound plausible to me, but I'm not an expert. This is why I'm wondering about this. Anyway, thanks for bearing with me. And if you do have any comments on this, any thoughts on this, please comment below. I would absolutely love to hear from you. And thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I really do appreciate it.